Hi everyone, Andrew Schultz, Principal Broker with Own Buffalo Inc. here, and I am coming to you today with some breaking news coming out of Washington. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have issued an eviction moratorium at a federal level, and I wanted to spend some time going through the text of the bill and explaining what that means for you as a housing provider. So we are going to jump over to our desktop screen here, and this is the text of the bill as it sits right now. This is scheduled to be published into the Federal Register on 9/4/20, which is this Friday. If you're watching this before Friday, this is not published yet. If you're watching this after the 4th, this is probably already published. You can find more information and the text of the bill at federalregister.gov/D/2020-19654. Link is right here. You can copy it off the screen. What I'm going to do is go through this documentation, this piece of legislation, and explain the bits and pieces and what it means for you as a housing provider. First thing is this order is effective, insert date of publication in the Federal Register through December 31st, 2020. So through the end of the year. And you can see up at the top that this is scheduled to be published in just a couple of days. There's a ton of background information in here. So essentially what had happened is President Trump had advised CDC, as well as a couple of other agencies in the federal government, to investigate whether or not a federal eviction moratorium would make sense given the current situation with the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the findings from the CDC, which indicates that yes, it makes sense for us to have this eviction moratorium. Here's why. All of that is kind of spelled out in this document, and then it goes on to explain who's eligible, how to get eligibility, how to determine eligibility, and things of that nature. Applicability. Under this order, a landlord, owner of a residential property, or other person with a legal right to pursue an eviction or possessory action shall not evict any covered person from any residential property in any jurisdiction to which this order applies during the affected period of the order. This is geared specifically towards residential properties. Commercial does not seem to be covered at all in the text of this bill. This order does not apply in any state, local, territorial, or tribal area with a moratorium on residential evictions that provides the same or greater level of public health protection than the requirements listed in this order. So if you live in a state where they already have an eviction moratorium in place and it is more restrictive than this, then that would be the moratorium that would supersede. If it's less restrictive than this, this would be the moratorium that would supersede. Nor does this order apply to any American Samoa which has reported no cases of COVID-19 until such time that there are cases reported. That was just an interesting carve-out that I noticed, and I wanted to make sure that I brought it up. No real reason. It was just one of those things that I thought was interesting. In accordance with 42 U.S.C. 264E, this order does not preclude state, local, territorial, and tribal authorities from imposing additional requirements that provide greater public health protection and are more restrictive than the requirements in this order. This order does not relieve any individual of an obligation to pay rent, make a housing payment, or comply with any other obligation that the individual may have under a tenancy, lease, or similar contract. Rent is still due. Nothing in this order precludes the charging or collecting of fees, penalties, or interest as a result of the failure to pay rent or other housing payment on a timely basis under the terms of any applicable contract. So we have not been able to charge late fees for several months now. Under this particular federal moratorium, it seems as though we're going to get our late fees and things like that back. Unless you have a state moratorium that has a restriction not permitting the late fees, you would have to double check on that individually. Renter or homeowner's declaration. We're going to get into this a little bit more in depth in a little bit. I'm actually going to show you the declaration that the tenant has to provide to you and what that declaration looks like. It's actually the last couple pages of this document. And this is a 37-page document, by the way, that I've parsed through to kind of pull the pertinent details out, if you will. To invoke the CDC's order, these persons must provide and execute a copy of the declaration form to their landlord or owner of the residential property where they live or other person, etc., etc. Each adult listed on the lease, residential lease agreement, or housing contract should likewise complete and provide a declaration. These persons may also still be evicted for reasons other than not paying rent or making a housing payment. So there's been an issue with a lot of people not being able to get nuisance tenants out. And by that, I mean tenants who are doing things, they may be paying rent, they may be making their rent payments in a timely fashion, but they're not following other parts of their lease. Maybe they are overcrowding the unit. They've moved people in that aren't supposed to be there, which is a health concern, per CDC. People who are dealing drugs, you now can get those people back out of your apartments and things like that. So people who are in violation of their lease for reasons other than non-payment, those people are still evictable under this federal moratorium. So we'll continue to scroll down through here. Covered persons means any tenant, lessee, or resident of a residential property who provides their landlord, the owner of the residential property, or other person with a legal right to pursue eviction, the declaration, which we're going to go over, indicating that the individual has used best efforts to obtain all available government assistance. The individual either expects to earn no more than $99,000 in annual income for calendar year 2020, or no more than $198,000 if filing a joint tax return, was not required to report any income in 2019, or received an economic impact stimulus check pursuant to the CARES Act. The individual is unable to pay the full rent or make a full housing payment due to substantial loss of household income, loss of compensable hours of work, wages, etc., etc. The individual is using best efforts to make timely partial payments that are as close to the full payment as the individual's circumstance may permit, taking into account other non-discretionary expenses. And 5, eviction would likely render the individual homeless or force the individual to move into and live in close quarters with a new congregate or shared living setting, trying to prevent overcrowding, essentially. Evict and eviction means any action by a landlord, etc., etc., to remove or cause the removal of a covered person, which we just discussed, from a residential property. The one thing I don't know, and I have an email out to my attorney asking this question, is does that mean we can't send late rent notices? Because that technically would be the precursor to the filings and things like that. So it's a little unclear, a little ambiguous to me as to whether or not we can still do our late rent payment. Our late rent notices. One thing this does point out is that this does not include foreclosure on a home mortgage. So we had an eviction moratorium that also covered foreclosures. That has since lapsed, and foreclosures are not covered under this current moratorium. So it looks like evictions will be back on the table. Scrolling down through here, this talks again about late fees. And then again, after that, it talks about nuisance tenants. And continuing to scroll down through here. Findings and actions. So this is basically the findings and actions of all of the information that they've gathered. I've determined that a temporary halt on evictions through December 31st, 2020, subject to further extension, modification, or rescission is appropriate. This may and very well will be extended further, so please keep that in mind. So we're going to continue to scroll down here. If any provision of this order or the application of any provision to any persons, entities, or circumstances shall be held invalid, the remainder of the provisions or the applications of such provisions, etc., etc., which is held invalid, blah, 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 shall remain valid. Basically, if any one provision of this is found to be invalid by a court of law, and I guarantee you this will be challenged. There's no doubt in my mind that this will 100% be challenged. But given where we're at in the court system currently, and the fact that this is only, as it sits right now, a 3-month moratorium, we're probably not going to get through the court process before the moratorium is set to expire. So that is something to keep in mind. If any one provision of this is found to be invalidated, all the rest of these provisions would remain in place. So there are some penalties here, criminal penalties here. A person violating this order may be subject to a fine of no more than $100,000 if the violation does not result in death, or 1 year in jail, or both, or a fine of no more than $250,000 if the violation results in a death, or 1 year in jail, or both, or is otherwise provided by law. An organization violating this order may be subject to a fine of no more than $200,000 per event. So if you have your property in an LLC, that might classify you as an organization in this instance. if the violation does not result in a death, or $500,000 per event if it does result in a death. So there are some pretty steep penalties for violating or attempting to violate this. Department of Housing and Urban Development has informed CDC that all HUD grantees, states, cities, communities, and nonprofits who received emergency solutions grants or community development block grant funds under the CARES Act may use these funds to provide temporary rental assistance, homelessness prevention, or aid to other individuals who are experiencing financial hardship because of the pandemic and are at risk of being evicted, consistent with the applicable laws, regulations, and guidance. Essentially, there's going to be a pile of money available that tenants can attempt to tap into to get some sort of rent payment in. I don't know how much. I don't know what the process for that will be yet, but there should be something there that'll allow tenants to try to get access to some government funds to help out. Effective date, the order is effective upon a publication in the Federal Register, scheduled for September 4th, and this will run through December 31st, 2020. So now we're getting into the attachment. This is actually what the tenant needs to provide to you in order to halt the eviction. And it's basically them certifying under penalty of perjury that the foregoing are true and correct. These are the points that they have to meet in order to be eligible. I have used best efforts to obtain all available government assistance for rent or housing. I expect to earn no more than $99,000 in calendar year 2020, $198 if filing joint, or was not required to report any income in 2019, or received an economic impact stimulus check. I'm unable to pay my rent or make full housing payments due to a substantial loss of household income, loss of compensable hours or wages, layoffs, extraordinary out-of-pocket medical expenses, using my best efforts to make a timely partial payment, and that these payments are as close to the full payment as individual circumstances may permit, taking into account other non-discretionary expenses, and if affected, I would likely become homeless, need to move into a homeless shelter, or need to move into a new residence shared by other people, etc., etc. I understand that I must still pay rent or make a housing payment and comply with other obligations that I have under my tenancy. I further understand that the fees, penalties, and interest for not paying rent or making a housing payment as required may still be charged or collected. I further understand that at the end of this temporary halt on evictions, December 31, 2020, my housing provider may require payment in full for all payments not made prior to and during the temporary halt, and failure to pay may make me subject to eviction pursuant to state and local laws. I understand that any false or misleading statements may result in criminal, civil actions, fines, penalties, etc., 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 signature of declarant and date. So this is what your tenant actually has to provide to you, indicating that they are attempting to stop an eviction based on this eviction moratorium. That's what the tenant has to provide to you. So we've now gone over who's eligible. We've also gone over who's covered. So it's all residential properties. We've gone over what tenants are eligible for this protection and what tenants are not eligible for this protection, and kind of spelled out what is going on here. As I mentioned, I think that this is going to be one of those situations where it will certainly be argued. It's definitely going to be talked about in court. It's going to be fought. You know, this is one of those things that a lot of people are looking at this and saying, this is not right. You're stripping away private property rights of the housing providers and basically letting tenants do whatever they want. This will be argued out in a court of law. There's no doubt in my mind. But as it sits right now, looks like it's going to be law of the land here in the United States. All of that being said, if you are interested in staying on top of this type of news, we actually post these videos pretty frequently, both on our Facebook page and on our YouTube page, facebook.com/Buffalo Foreclosed Homes, or you can just head over to ownbuffalo.com and find links to all of our social media. We also offer 3 free 30-minute phone consultations over at ownbuffalo.com. If you have a question that wasn't answered in this video and you think I might be able to help answer it, feel free to go over to ownbuffalo.com, grab one of those free 30-minute consultations, either on the phone or we can do a Zoom call. I'd be glad to help you out in any way that I possibly can. Guys, I do need to reiterate that I am not an attorney. I'm a real estate broker here in the state of New York, and that this video shall not in any way be deemed to constitute legal, financial, or tax advice. Talk to your team, talk to your attorney, make sure that you understand the ins and outs of this before you make any moves. This is for informational purposes only. I'm glad that I was able to provide the information to you, but don't go making decisions based off of video you watched on the internet. Definitely talk to your legal counsel before making any decisions. Thank you all so much for watching. Feel free to check us out over at ownbuffalo.com, and we'll see you with the next update.